Welcome back. We ended part one with our definitions of BIPOC and newcomer. Now let's turn to discussing a few more key terms related to care. Let's talk about race and what it means. Race is a socially constructed concept. There is no genetic basis to race. Race was created to position people on a hierarchy for the purpose of power. Race places people into categories based on characteristics like physical appearance, particularly skin color, and presumed cultural history and ancestral heritage. Race is constructed by racism and has implications for how society is structured economically, politically, and geographically. We recognize that the fact that race is a social construct may be new information for some. We encourage you to learn more about race as a social construct by reviewing the references included at the end of this training module. Dr. Camara Jones, noted family physician and epidemiologist, provides a theoretical framework for understanding racism and how it functions. Let's unpack what we mean by racism by using her three-level framework. Dr. Jones defines institutionalized racism as differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. Institutionalized racism can look like district hiring practices that weed out BIPOC people from leadership positions. Personally mediated racism is loosely defined as prejudice and discrimination, or acts that happen person to person, so to speak. Examples include an educator describing a young Black girl as articulate, but not her white counterpart who uses the same cadence and vocabulary, as if it is expected of the white child, but not the Black girl. Internalized racism involves BIPOC people accepting negative societal messages about their own abilities and intrinsic worth. Internalized racism can look like a Black or brown child thinking they can only excel in athletics because they have internalized the societal message that the abilities of BIPOC people are limited to sports. Of note, other forms of oppression like sexism, for instance, show up at similar levels. There will be an opportunity to listen to Dr. Jones' TED Talk on this framework in your live activities at your school. Another important term we'd like to define is intersectionality. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term to explain the gender and racial oppression experienced by African American women. We'll view a 2-minute video on intersectionality now. As you watch, please reflect on this following question. What multiple forms of inequity interact and have an impact on students, families, and/or staff in your district?
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit, it is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
So let me give you a couple more moments to consider this question again. What multiple forms of inequity interact and have an impact on students, families, and/or staff in your school or district? Here is an example of overlapping forms of oppression. In this example, let's consider racism, heterosexism, and cisnormativity. We've already defined racism, so let's take a moment to define these other two terms. Heterosexism involves assuming that heterosexuality is the social norm and that straight people are socially and culturally superior to LGBTQ plus people. Cisnormativity involves assuming that cisgender is the norm and privileging this identity over other gender identities like transgender or gender non-binary. Here are some statistics on how these forms of oppression interact and impact youth in schools. In a 2021 national survey, 42% of LGBTQ plus youth seriously considered attempting suicide, including more than half of transgender and non-binary youth. In schools, Black and Latinx transgender youth have lower rates of school connectedness compared to their white transgender peers. And when compared to Black and Latinx cisgender youth, Black and Latinx transgender youth experience higher rates of depression, suicidality, and harassment, and lower levels of caring adult relationships. These statistics underscore the importance of using an intersectionality lens to promote equity. Now let's transition to discussing how inequities show up in schools. Inequities in schools often show up as disparities and disproportionalities. A disparity is an unequal outcome for one group compared to another group. A disproportionality describes when there is under or overrepresentation of a group in a particular category relative to the group's total percentage. For example, if 20% of students in a school are Black, but 30% of students who are suspended are Black, this is a suspension disproportionality. The previous example unfortunately reflects a common problem within our schools. That is the issue of school disciplinary disproportionalities, where Black and Latinx students receive harsher and more exclusionary discipline in schools than their white peers who exhibit the same behaviors. Inequities often result from adults in schools treating students differently based on their identities. A study found that teachers rated student levels of anger and aggression based on the student's race. Additionally, pre-service teachers were more likely to expect misbehavior in Black students compared to white students. Also, when behavioral difficulties do occur, white students are more likely to be referred for mental health supports, while BIPOC students are more likely to receive disciplinary action. These problems ultimately result in BIPOC children receiving less instructional time, which contributes to the racialized academic opportunity gap. Let's talk briefly now about educational disparities. Research has found that non-Black educators have lower academic expectations for Black students than Black educators. Also, white and Asian students are more likely to be exposed to advanced level courses or gifted and talented education than Black or Latinx students. There's also decades of research demonstrating that Black and Latinx students are overrepresented in special education. Of note, more recent research has found that some schools, particularly those that serve predominantly BIPOC students, under-identify Black and Brown students with disabilities. Similarly, newcomer youth are under or overrepresented in special education, largely due to language barriers. Educators are challenged to discern between lack of knowledge and skills and limited ability to articulate knowledge in English. Underrepresentation can occur when referral processes are stalled or ignored out of an assumption that students' challenges are language-based. lack of culturally valid assessment tools, assessments in students' native language, and skilled bilingual evaluators to administer assessments exacerbate the challenge of effectively or appropriately building on newcomer student academic strengths and meeting their needs. And of course, undue burden is placed on newcomer students to serve as translators for adults, sometimes including translating information that is developmentally or otherwise inappropriate for them to be sharing. We see the same patterns of inequities mirrored in the mental health care system. For one, individuals from groups that are marginalized experience significant barriers to accessing mental health services. Additionally, even when folks from communities that are marginalized do access services, they too often receive poor treatment. For instance, in schools, BIPOC students are less likely to receive psychoeducation about mental health supports than their white peers. Also, in some cases, BIPOC people are more likely to be misdiagnosed by mental health providers. There is also a history of LGBTQ plus people being harmed by unaffirming and oppressive practices, such as the heterosexist and transphobic practice of conversion therapy. Conversion therapy is now banned among professional academies and governing bodies in mental health care, but unfortunately is still practiced by some individuals and institutions and has resulted in the traumatization of generations of LGBTQ plus people in the United States. Now that we have discussed some of the ways that inequities play out in schools more broadly, please take a moment to reflect on how BIPOC and/or newcomer students are negatively impacted by racism and other forms of oppression in your school community.